We're all pretty familiar with the traditional activities associated with real men. There's football, weightlifting, cars, and construction, just to name a few. But what about things like cooking, gardening, and changing diapers? Not long ago, those activities were considered too girlish for real men. Stuff like that was for sissies. Men were men and women were, well, not men. But guess what? Times are changing fast, and men like women are trying new things that break all the gender rules. It's time to make knitting the manly art it used to be because, hey, we're the ones who invented it. So guys, grab your sticks, otherwise known as knitting needles, and join us in hand-to-hand combat with a ball of yarn as you learn to knit. Thousands of men braver than you are doing it. Go ahead, make yourself a hat, a scarf, a sweater, or even a codpiece. It'll keep you warm at the next football game. While no one knows for sure who the first person was to pick up two sticks, wind some yarn around their fingers, and create the first knit stitch, it's pretty clear that men had a lot to do with the development of the craft. The oldest reliable sample of knitting was a pair of blue and white socks, believed to have been made in Islamic Egypt somewhere between 1200 and 1500 AD. From the Middle East, it's believed that knitting spread to Europe through Spain by the Moors, and the rest is history. Knitting wasn't an overnight sensation, however. The metal needles were difficult to make in those days, and European fashion dictated that stockings and hats be made of cloth, not wool. But by the mid-1500s, knitted stockings were finally in vogue, and some trade organizations or guilds began to focus on the production of hats and stockings for the upper classes. By 1600, England was a leading exporter of knitted stockings. Wool gloves and shirts had become popular as well. In 1589, William Lee invented what became known as the knitting machine, and though it didn't catch on immediately, it eventually changed the industry that had been dominated by men. Within a few decades, hand knitting was no longer a very lucrative occupation, and men left it to the womenfolk so they could seek a better living. Throughout the 17th and 18th century, knitting spread to Scandinavia and Russia, and by early 19th century, knitting was well established throughout Europe. As Europeans colonized the Americas, knitting developed cultural and regional differences, and new styles were born. Ireland became known for their cable sweaters, the Scottish Fair Isles for their intricate patterned designs, Peru and Bolivia for their cholos, or colorful caps. These were all created by artistic male and female knitters during this period, and are still made today. Knitting was a way for the working class to help supplement meager incomes from fishing and farming, and children were taught to knit at a very early age. Boys often knit their own socks, while girls and women knit garments to sell. There were well-known English doctors who knit in the early 20th century. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, a proud knitter who taught his sons to knit, was quoted as saying, "Knitting is a distinct virtue. It's reflective and repetitive. Whenever you can engage in doing a purely repetitive thing, your mind can reflect upon life." The two world wars inspired both men and women to knit. Women knit for the soldiers, and men knit to quell boredom on long train and ship journeys. Some soldiers were even taught to knit as part of their survival training.
Men were knitting socks for themselves through both world wars. And men in other countries continue to knit, particularly in South America. It remains a male craft, and quite an intricate one. It's really only in North America that, and I guess in Western Europe, where it's seen as being pretty much the exclusive domain of women, although obviously that's changing or I wouldn't be here.
Knitting isn't really something that's ever struck me as being particularly masculine or particularly feminine. I mean, it's tying knots, really, at the end of the day, and I don't particularly think that you have to be a sissy to tie a knot, but sailors do it, and sailors, they're known to be very masculine. So.
Sailors were probably the most prolific knitters, and even developed some knitting traits that were distinctively male. They preferred stranded colors and had a strong dislike for written directions. What a surprise.
I was much of a sailor most of my life, and if you're out to sea for any length of time, you got to have things to do, otherwise if you're on a tanker, you get tankeritis.
I started knitting when I was in the Navy. I was in the Navy for 8 years, 8 years. And when I was in the Navy, there was a friend of mine who was knitting an Afghan in the lounge one day on our ship. And I thought, what a great idea. We're going to be out to sea for 6 months at a time. It's a great idea to have something to do to occupy your time.
For many men, dexterity and ability to handle fine material runs into trouble. They stop and they get frustrated and they get cumbersome and feel like they can't manipulate the material. And that's when we stop and backtrack and say, okay, just remember, handle it slowly and then you can handle it faster later. If I treat the knitting experience like a workout at the gym, I get a lot further with the male student.
Many men still learn to knit as children, usually from a patient female relative.
My grandma taught me around last Christmas, and I've just been knitting since she taught me.
My mom was visiting probably when Anders was about 6, and she had found this beautiful yarn shop and brought some yarn home, and Anders just was fascinated watching her knit, and he just really wanted to do it, and he got so frustrated learning, but eventually stuck with it and picked it up.
One of my grade school teachers came to school and she had a suit on that she had knit, and I thought, you can knit fabric and make it fit your body with just 2 sticks and some string, and I thought, that's amazing. So I went off and got 2 toothpicks and some string, and I must have known how to knit somehow, so I made a little sample, and I just took off after that.
Well, I started 5 years old. We had no television and no radio. We sat around in the evenings and somebody read a story. And by the time I was 10, I'd heard most of the classics. Don't remember any of them, but I had a little stuffed rabbit. He needed scarves. It was pretty cold. So I knitted the scarves for the little rabbit, and that's how I started.
Others learn as adults from friends and family members, and often these mentors are rewarded with the fruits of their labors.
I was designing knitwear for the longest, but I never knew how to knit physically. So I went to the church that I go to, and they taught me how to knit. And that's been about 1.5 years now.
I saw a lady knitting on the bus one morning on my way to work, and I hadn't thought about it until then, but watching her cast on was fascinating to watch, and I felt the need to learn how to knit.
Well, being a guy, I didn't know the first step. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know anything. So first I went to a hobby shop and kind of got blown off, and I think last year being it was something about it. The knitting had just taken a huge craze. Everybody was knitting last year, and so I was like the last one in, but I was the first guy they had seen, and so they kind of blew me off. So then I went to another place, and they gave me a few things but didn't really tell me anything, and I ended up going to a department store where a lady was totally kind. She showed me what I should get. I picked out the yarn and I picked out the things, and then she gave me these big fat needles, and I was looking at it like, this isn't what I thought it was. And I was a total beginner at that point, and she showed me how to start it up right there in the store. We spent probably a half an hour. She took her whole lunch and sat there with me while I learned, and I started on a scarf and made it about 6 inches before she finally let me go.
Just like many women, some stick with it while others give it up. Sometimes forever, sometimes until they have a reason to start again.
I'm a grandfather, and I've been doing a lot of knitting for my brand new grandson, who is just now 6 months old. And I'm knitting family presents, things like that.
I think I finished a hat and one scarf. Yeah, I made one orange hat.
Well, I learned from Stephen last November. I went to art school, and after graduating, like most artists, got a 9-to-5 job and wasn't in the studio and not doing anything creative for a very, very, very long time. And when I heard that Stephen was knitting, I figured it was a way to get back into doing something creative that had a pretty low bar of entry. It didn't really take a lot to learn. It didn't cost a lot to learn, at least initially. But as we all know, once you learn how to knit, you fall under the spell of yarn lust.
Many men will agree that knitting fascinates them because of its mathematical structure.
I actually have a Bachelor of Mathematics, which certainly has helped a bit with the knitting.
What I find is when men come up to my display in a festival or something, they look at the work and they say, "Oh, I see what you're doing there. You're doing tumbling blocks. You're just going one stitch out each time. You're just doing this structure, and then I see you. Oh yes, right." And they just kind of get it and go off.
I mean, science has told us that men and women think differently, since time began. But I didn't notice it until I started knitting so much. Like cables. My first sweater that I'm working on right now is full of cables. It's got like 17 different cable patterns in it. And I show it off, and so many women are like, "Oh God, I could never do that. Too many cables. They make no sense to me." And they're the easiest thing in the entire world.
This may be why men seem less intimidated than women to try new techniques initially, but this isn't always the case.
I don't know if I'd enjoy the mathematical part of it. I mean, I do like, how many stitches do I need and to, make the size I want. But for the most part, I do it just to relax. I mean, the less thinking I actually have to do, the better off.
I think the thing I like best about the knitting is color, is playing with color, combining the textures of yarns and the colors of yarns. Just doing ordinary plain old knitting is kind of boring.
I try to have projects on the go where it's they're teaching projects. They may not really work out well, but for me, they're great because I get to learn something, even if it may not be the prettiest or the most useful thing.
So I'd always thought socks were just incredibly challenging, sort of the Mount Everest of knitting. And but I was very determined that I was going to learn how to do them. And then once I actually figured it out, it wasn't that difficult. And so I like setting up challenges for myself, I guess.
Yeah. And back in the 50s, I started collecting lace knitting patterns from a bookstore in Big Sur, California. It was called Craft and Hobby Bookstore. And the patterns were so beautiful, I thought, I've got to have these. And then one day I sat down and knitted one of the patterns, and I thought, oops, that's it. So I put aside the sweaters and the afghans and the gloves and everything, and been doing mostly lace ever since.
I think that that's the appeal of cable knitting for me, is that it all makes sense, and I don't have to. I remember early on when we started with the sweaters and using the cable needle, and I hated the cable needle because I kept losing it in the couch, and as being somebody who had to knit everywhere, I always had to have this extra needle with me that was always being lost, and I very quickly decided that it was a very bad idea for me to cable with a needle, and so I worked out how to cable without the cable needle, because I was going to be about 72 by the time I finished the sweater if I was going to keep using the cable needle.
My son asked for a pair of kilt socks for Christmas, and I'm doing that, and it's kind of boring. But it's been a struggle. This is one sock, and I tried this on. It's down to the ankle. I tried it on, and it was way too tight. Because I took a regular sock pattern, tried to make it bigger and adapt it so that it would work. And on me, that thing is stretched out so far that it's too tight, and I'm sure my son's leg is bigger than mine.
I'm actually in awe of the men that I see here at the Monday Night Knit group, because they knit like, you know, these vests and these jackets and these elaborate designs, and I'm, you know, I'm like, oh, scarf. Yeah. You know, but it's still very fun, and I get great ideas from them, so it's inspiring.
Several noteworthy men have revolutionized knitting in the last century and should be mentioned. In 1921, the Prince of Wales wore a Fair Isle pullover to a polo match and started a fashion craze that lasted for decades. Fair Isle gloves, hats, and sweaters were all the rage during the 20s and 30s, making that tiny remote Scottish island a household word. Following on his fashionable heels, in the early 60s, a young American named Cape Fassett bought his first yarn on a trip to Scotland and learned to knit on a train literally overnight.
And I bought 20 colors of yarn, thinking I have got to knit a sweater that has all of this landscape in it, and got on the train back to London and said to a woman sitting across from me, I've got to knit a sweater, because nobody could follow the directions that I would give them for a sweater, and I've got a sweater I've got to make. So she said, oh, it's easy, I'll show you. Have you got needles? And I said, yes, I bought some needles for this yarn. And she showed me how to cast on, how to knit a few rows, and off we went. And when I got to London, I went to a store and bought a little 9-penny knitting pattern that had raglan sleeves, and I put all 20 colors in my first sweater and took it straight to Vogue.
Cape Fassett's painterly influence on the craft were quite remarkable. His unique sense of color and design influenced a new generation of knitters, including his student and now business partner, Brandon Mabley. Together they have built an empire and traveled the world, inspiring students with their unique knitting and patchwork techniques and vision.
The first design that I ever did was about 6 months after I joined the studio. I'd flicked through a book of simple watercolors, and there was just a basic drawing of an Indian basket, and there you could easily see that it was striped and it had 2 colors in the basket structure. So I related that structure into a knit design, knitted up a little swatch, and showed it to the managing director of Rowan Yarns, which is the company that we design with, and they said, yeah, we'll do it. And for the first few years, my designs were published under K Fassett Studio. So I was the studio, and K was K Fassett. And then a couple of years after that, fortunately, I was able to have the name on my own design. So, well, hey, here I go. Look out.
If you are awakened to the importance of color and the magic properties of color, how it can absolutely transform your mood and your health and everything, then I think you start to look at the world in a different way. I've had people come to my classes and drive off a road the next morning coming back to the second day of the workshop because they were looking at the color for the first time on a road they've traveled all their lives. So it's true that we can awaken one's sensitivity to color, I think.
Men like this have helped pave the way for a new generation who are not concerned with whether knitting is for girls only.
I'm secure and I'm comfortable. I'm not afraid of people seeing me knit.
I was born in Wisconsin and grew up in Wisconsin and Wyoming. I've been a Packers fan for pretty much my entire life. And I will sit and knit and watch a Packer game and be loud and stupid and male and scream and yell and holler at the TV and knit. And people just look at me like, what in the world are you doing? That shouldn't be happening.
It's probably the American view of knitters. It's a woman's occupation.
I was an oddity, and I met a few men who were also oddities. If you came to a yarn shop and you said, I'm looking for yarns, they would say, oh, is that for your mother, dear? Because those yarns don't go together.
Many men knit in public.
Logically, I know that I'm not the only guy who knits. I can't be, because there's so many websites devoted to it right now, and there's so many people talking about it.
No, I've never been made fun of at school for knitting.
Well, I learned on the train, so I was out of the closet from day one. I had nowhere to hide.
I
I was knitting in the car when my mom picked me up from school once, and lots of kids just said, that's a girly thing to do, but I don't really care, because it just doesn't bother me.
Yeah, it's just fun. Do what you want to do.
Yesterday, when I picked them up from school, they just jumped in the car and grabbed their knitting needles, and I had probably 6 kids hanging through the windows that were waiting for their parents to pick them up, and they were all just watching the boys knit, and they weren't in the least bit, embarrassed by it or anything. They seemed pretty proud of it, so.
In fact, if anything, the attention they get is positive.
It's a very odd experience being a man who knits in public. I've done it in lineups at the film festival, I've done it on the bus, on the streetcar, on the plane. Generally, I find that people are very curious. Maybe this is a Canadian thing. They're very curious, but they don't want to approach you. At the same time, the people who inevitably approach me are women. Women love to run up. They sometimes just can't help themselves. Oh, what are you working on? Oh, that's really lovely. Oh, can I feel it? I get this whole thing where people just really want to touch the knitting.
I've met a lot of grandmothers who are very curious, and I think first they check to see if I'm really a boy, and then they're curious about what I'm actually knitting. And because I like to do cable knit stuff, they're often really surprised that I'm not just knitting a scarf or washcloth or something. So that's quite good. I had one grandmother try to get me to knit with my other hand and was very disgusted when I couldn't work it out, and so she just ignored me for the rest of the trip because I was really pathetic in her eyes.
I've had some really mean things said over the years, and the mean things are usually done by women, not other men. It's usually women.
I've only had compliments of curiosity. What are you knitting? Oh, how lovely. Oh, my auntie used to do that, and I used to knit, and so acknowledgement.
And my experience has been that it's people don't generally approach you about it. I mean, very seldom do people even comment on it. I'll get looks. People will look and see what I'm doing.
I used to be nervous about knitting in public. In fact, I used to not let people know that I sewed at all. I do a lot of tailoring and fine sewing. I made my wife's wedding dress, and nobody was allowed to know that. But that was 35 years ago. Times have changed. I've gotten to be an old man. I figure I'm old, I can wear purple. And so I have no problem with knitting in public now. I knit on the streetcar. I knit around here with no problem.
Yeah. I've knitted in public. It's I don't really think it bothered me, but I'd work at an independent theater, a Palm Theater, and in between shows, you could just sit down, you could knit, and there's someone else there who knitted. And if you actually watch a movie and knit, it's kind of simple. Like, you'd look down every now and then, just make sure you haven't dropped a stitch. But yeah, knitting in public is no big deal.
I did keep it fairly quiet when I was just starting out again. So like in my early 20s, I didn't really let many people know I knit. But into my 30s, I just found I wanted to knit more and more. And I just started knitting almost anywhere. Most of the knitting I do these days is actually on the public transit, because I've got maybe about half an hour, 45 minutes to get to work each way.
It's not a solitary hobby any longer. And in saying that, before, people would buy yarn and go home and knit. Here we have conventions. I think, Stitches and TKJ, the Knitting Guild of America conferences, have made it a thing to do.
And some have found a whole knitting community on the internet with sites and chat rooms that are dedicated specifically to men who knit.
You know about the Men Who Knit website. I'm actually the one who designed the logo for that one, for the site.
It's possible now to have a community without actually even necessarily meeting the people or being in the same country as the people who are doing it. So, so that's quite cool. And it means that you don't feel as alone as you might, because it's really rare to come across somebody who's a man sitting in a park knitting.
For many, the best time to knit is while traveling, in an airplane or just going to and from work. Some even knit at work.
We just
knit in the car when we're bored or on long road trips, and yeah. It's a good way to pass the time, and it's fun. Yeah.
Knitting is a really neat thing for here at work, because at work, as a makeup artist, I make up the people in the first hour and a half before the performance. And then I sit down. They're on stage, they're doing things. They come off, I clean them up, I touch them up, I change the color of their wig, I put on more whiskers, I change whiskers, whatever. Fix up smudges, they go back out and they sing some more, and I sit. Some people do crossword puzzles, several people knit, and I found that knitting is very handy. I can pick it up and put it down, hopefully not lose my place. So.
And men's knitting groups have started springing up in cities across the U.S. and other countries. For many, it's a social thing.
I think it's nice having a supportive knitting community. It was so important to me in those freak out moments when I was dropping stitches or there was mistakes and I didn't understand. I could just rip out a section and go back up. Having experienced knitters around makes you a better knitter, and spending time with other knitters, like, you can't underestimate how important it is to knit with other people, I think.
Knitting in a group is almost like a whole different thing, because it's sort of like you're looking at other people's projects, and if you have questions you could ask someone, and that is so valuable. And I guess that was part of the motivation for starting the group, is to sort of have this group of folks that you could ask questions and help and exchange ideas. And then people started bringing in yarn and needles and that they weren't using anymore, and it's become a really sort of close, I want to avoid saying close-knit. It's become a very tight group.
As the craft of knitting becomes more and more popular, will it catch on with more men?
I think knitting is catching on a lot with men. I've seen more men in the yarn stores. I've seen a lot of guys come in with their wives or girlfriends to help them pick out the yarn for a project.
I've heard of a lot more guys knitting, and also a lot more younger guys knitting, like young teenage lads that find it just is a satisfying thing to do, and the women love it. Women love to see men knit.
The guys that are in my group, we're all rugby players. We play football. We're a rough group of guys, and it takes somebody like me actually to actually say, hey, guess what, I'm knitting a scarf this Christmas, for anyone else to go, oh, maybe that sounds like a good idea. So then maybe it's a little more accepted. So
I think that that there's a certain self-expression, a sort of creativity that I think appeals to guys, and that they're seeing that it's okay to knit, and that it's kind of like, it's sort of like the new yoga.
I was in the back of a taxi, and this big bruiser was driving the taxi with a half-grown beard, he looked like a biker. And I said to my friend, Charles, the world's divided between those people who crochet and those people who knit. And the taxi driver said, right on, mate! And I wasn't sure which he did. I didn't dare to ask him. But obviously there's a few of us out there,
Many creative people have taken knitting to new and daring heights, including artists Debbie New, Mark Newport, and Dave Cole, who have muddied the lines between craft and art and inspired knitters to experiment with yarn and its infinite possibilities.
I like designers who make you think about knitting and creating fabric in different ways than the conventional.
I was thinking of making like a little circle thing, like a beanie, except without the head, like without it closing, like putting it on my dog. So when we go skiing, it would be as cold. Sometimes I think I want to make some pants. It might be kind of hard, but I think it'd be really comfortable, like wearing them when you're asleep in bed. It'd be comfy.
Most of us are content to stick with knitting needles we can actually hold with two hands. But we knit for different reasons.
Most of my knitting has been, I think, basic following patterns. I like how rote it is. I do online marketing, and I feel like I work in the theoretical a lot, or I work in things that aren't easily measured. And with knitting, it's just constant forward progress. Even if you have to rip something out, you learn something from it, and you'll knit it better next time. And it's a world of perfect logic. Like, it's loops within loops, and it just kind of makes sense.
Some find knitting a chance to relax and don't want to be concerned with the minute details that some patterns dictate. Others love the challenge and want to use as many colors or stitches as possible.
It looks really, really complicated, but it isn't.
This is the first pair of socks.
This purse right here for my mom.
It's a lace shawl. I'm not sure if you can see much of it right now, but
my my second and last project was this scarf here, which is just garter, and then you have the fringe, and this I did for my wife.
I like knitting a bunch of different colors just because it's cool watching the colors change as you keep on going.
Well, color work doesn't really interest me at all. I like texture, so I do a lot of cable stuff. I've recently started getting into lace, which is another means for texture besides cable.
For me, what lifts my skirt, it's what the South Africans say, it's what turns me on, is the colours. I'm not interested in doing anything technical. I do the basic stocking stitch, and the simple technique that we do, which we show in our workshops, allows you to put in unlimited colours, and it's what we call angst-free knitting.
But almost all knitters agree on one thing. Knitting is a healthy and rewarding activity.
For me, it's a peaceful, meditative type of thing. I have a fairly stressful job, and I use it as a stress reliever, for one thing. But I also really like doing things with my hands.
My daughter has a king-size bed, so she got a king-size lace weight. I did it on a 3-needle with 962 stitches on a row, and it's now residing on her bed.
I'm an advocate of creative health, and it's a concept that I've spread as long as I've knitted. It can help heal people with diseases that require deep personal introspective transformation in their behavior, such as cancer. It can also help people just improve their sense of achievement.
I don't know, I don't think I've ever seen somebody get totally obsessed with it, or more than maybe my mom would, but that's, I don't know, I call that more of a passion than an obsession.
As the world seems fixated on speed and instant gratification, knitting is being embraced by men and women who are searching for soul-satisfying activities. Many men find that they like to balance their active lives with quiet pastimes like knitting.
When I started knitting, I didn't think it was going to be so fun, but when I started it was fun for me, like much more than I thought it would be.
The meditative qualities of knitting, sometimes referred to as the new yoga, offer us a chance to slow down, relax, reflect, and create.
There is just something about it. You're rubbing these two sticks together, I always say, and you're just feeding this yarn through, and it's a nice feeling. You know, the fiber is nice, and I'm working with bamboo needles, that's nice. The whole process is elegant and lovely and soothing. It seems to me, after I've knitted for just a few minutes, I'm calmer and I'm happy, and also I'm progressing a progression of colors, and so I've got color, tactile feelings, progression of a work. The whole thing is just a lovely experience, and I never get tired of it. I've knitted for 40 years without stop, and I can't wait to get up the next morning when I'm in the middle of a knitting project. It is something absolutely thrilling to do. So it is very satisfying to the soul, I think.
It's, you know, it's like listening to the grandfather clock ticking on the pendulum, tick, 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 you know, being hypnotized. You just, I don't know, your mind becomes wider and more open, and then if you're working with colors and you pin it up, stand back and look at it, you think, wow, I did that. I'm not so bad after all.
In 50 years from now, I don't know if people will really understand the level of fear and the level of tension that people live with on a daily basis. Men need to knit because people need to do something with their hands that is not violent, that is not destructive, and I think more than ever people want beautiful things.
What more wonderful thing you can do than sit down and knit a wonderful sweater and think about somebody you adore that's going to get that sweater, your favorite aunt or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your whatever, you know, that into it can pour all the affection and time. You're giving them time. What a wonderful present.
Knitters are the best people.
He was working on a scarf that he was gonna make for this girl he has a crush on, and but that work out the scarf. He never really got to finish that one because it was really hard yarn. He just kind of, it fell apart, and he just kind of forgot about it. But
forget about the girl too?
Not yet.
So my knitting party trick involves this cable needle and what to do with it when you're not knitting. It spends a lot of time in my mouth or behind my ear normally when I'm knitting, but a special few of us can hold it this way, finish the row, and then to take it out when you need it.
A woman came up and just said, "So are you promoting men knitting?" Like pretty much in that tone. And I said, "Well, I guess I'd have to say I promote everyone knitting." You know, and she kind of shrugged and walked off. But that's really, I think that men knitting is remarkable, and I wish that it weren't.